Writing opens up a space, a signature between appearance and disappearance. Rambling space. That's the space we come into this evening. I'm Trevor Bechtel, Dean here at Grebel, and I'm most happy to invite you to this Mennonite Writing Series event, the fourth in our current series. I opened with a sentence, a theologian's rendering of one of the high points of a ramble that tonight's speaker gave at our community supper just an hour ago. It was a wonderful event. I'd like to introduce to you Rob Zacharias, a Banting Fellow in the Department of English here at the University of Waterloo and the organizer of this writing series. Today, Rob finished an essay on spatial politics and post-colonialism, an essay that could get a more exciting title. But the collection that commissioned the essay might insist on the boring title. Along with the rambling kind of nature of how I've experienced the evening so far, I'd like to also tell you that Rob really likes basketball. Rob.
I'm gonna grab this mic. Okay, that's all true. That's all true. Our last reader was Miriam Toews, and when she received her Writer's Trust Award this year, she was giving her thanks at this big gala. And she was saying her thanks to the various people who were important to her and have been important to the book, including her mother, whom she thanked profusely. And if you've read the book, you know that the mother character in this book is really the hero of the book. She's the dynamo. And she says, but unfortunately, Miriam said, my mother couldn't be here today. She has Raptors tickets, and the Raptors are in town. Which was true, and they won the game. So good evening once again, and let me welcome you, and I think I'm welcoming most of you back. My name is Rob Zacharias. I am a Banting postdoctoral fellow in the Department of English, Language, and Literature here at the University of Waterloo, and it's my honor to introduce Patrick Friesen to you this evening. Before I get to Patrick, however, I want to begin tonight as I've begun the other nights, and that is to welcome you to the larger series that tonight's reading is a part. I know many of you have been tracking with us over the past several months, but if there's anybody new here tonight, let me welcome you especially and catch you up on what you've missed. The series began back in October when Rudy Wiebe joined us to read from his new novel, Come Back. We then had the first poet in the series, Jeff Gundy, the American poet who joined us as part of the Bechtel Lectures series, and he read from his new collection of poems entitled Somewhere Near Defiance. The last reading of the fall was with Miriam Toews, who read from her best-selling new novel, All My Puny Sorrows. I was particularly thrilled with how the series has gone so far, and I've been eagerly waiting for us to continue here tonight. And also, as I have done at the outset of each of these events, I want to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the support that has made the series possible. Conrad Grebel, of course, continues to be a most gracious host, while the Institute for Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies, along with the Department of English, Language, and Literature just across the river over there, have been generous sponsors. I'd also like to acknowledge the Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, which has funded my 2-year adventure here at the University of Waterloo. And I'm also particularly pleased to note that the next 4 readings, including tonight, have been sponsored by the Canada Council for the Arts. The Canada Council for the Arts is the major funding body in Canada for literary events, cultural events, and we're particularly pleased to have them on board for this series. It means we can bring people like Patrick all the way from the West Coast, but we also see it as an affirmation of the value of the series itself. And of course, I should thank each of you, the audience members, for making it out week after week. I do recognize a lot of the faces, and it's nice to have a sort of a sense of collectivity as we journey forward reading these new works. But to the matter at hand. Now based in Victoria, British Columbia, Patrick Friesen was born in Steinbach, Manitoba. He was long based in Winnipeg, however, where he studied at the University of Manitoba, where he was the founding president of the Manitoba Writers Guild, and was a central figure in that first flowering of writing by Mennonites in the 1980s. And in fact, he served as a mentor for a number of the writers who would later become central figures in the field. Patrick's first book of poetry was The Lands That I Am, published by Turnstone in 1976. Over nearly 40 years of writing, he's published 15 books of poetry, a book of essays, several plays, and co-translations of several Danish poets. His best-known works probably include Blasphemer's Wheel, which was awarded the Manitoba Book of the Year Prize in 1996, A Broken Bowl, which was a finalist for the 1997 Governor General's Award, and Jumping in the Asylum, which won the ReLit Award for Poetry in 2012. I was re-watching Patrick's talk that he gave the last time he was here, which was in 2012 as part of the Mennonite writing series that Hildy had organized. And he was reflecting on his early career, mentioning that in his early writing he wanted to, and I'm quoting here, sing like an angel, but also sing like a devil. Over the years, we might say he succeeded. In 2002, he published a book called The Breath You Take from the Lord. 2 years later, his next book was The Bordello Poems. He's also the author of my all-time favorite title for a collection of poetry, and that's the 1992 collection, You Don't Get to Be a Saint. And of course, this audience will be well acquainted with his 1980 long poem, The Shunning, which he adapted as a well-received play in 1985, I believe, and was most recently staged in 2010. Scholars have often noted a musical foundation to Patrick's poetry, and, perhaps not unrelated, a biblical tone that paces the writing, much of which includes careful explorations of relationships, as well as spiritual concerns, including birth, death, and so on. His work ranges from extended narrative poems to short, taut, imagistic pieces. In 2012, Friesen won the P.K. Page Founders Award for his poem Storm Windows, and the judge's remark on that poem have always struck me as a nice summary of his work. Friesen's writing, the judges noted, quote, goes an extra step in conjuring up and offering an experience of poetry's ability to transform consciousness, to alter perception, and to enlarge our awareness of ourselves, our world, and our lives. It goes on resonating with the sense of power, the troubling beauty, and the mysterious significance of ordinary experience, end quote. Patrick is a busy man during his visit here to Waterloo. Just a couple of hours ago, as Trevor noted, he gave a talk at Grebel's Community Supper. That was also the first community supper I've ever been to, and they are an event. And he talked to several hundred very interested and energetic students, as well as faculty members. Tomorrow, he'll be speaking as part of the Canadian Literature Lecture Series here on campus with our friends at the St. Jerome's College. Tonight, however, he's all ours. I've asked Patrick to read for somewhere between half an hour and 45 minutes, after which I will join him on stage for a quick conversation about his work. There will be time for questions from the audience as well, so if anything piques your interest through his reading or through the conversation, please do jot down your questions. Dennis Lee has described Patrick as, quote, one of the poets we cannot do without. I think that's true. Please help me welcome Patrick Friesen.
I was at a reading once where the reader had one of these, and she was struggling with the flu, and she excused herself, went to the washroom, and forgot to turn this off. Thank you very much for coming out here, and thank you, Rob and Trevor, Hildy and Paul for putting me up for about the 30th time, I guess, and lovely to see you here. I'm reading completely new stuff, so I'm going to ask for your patience. And it's going to be divided into two. The first is a book that's coming out in April called A Short History of Crazy Bone, who is a middle-aged woman who's wandering through a rural area. It's never mentioned where, but of course, I come from Manitoba. That's where the landscape is. And I'm going to find out how to read it because parts of it are in normal print and They describe her environment and what she's doing, and in italics is her speaking aloud. Most of the book is her talking to herself. And she's a kind of a trickster, eccentric. This doesn't really matter for the poems now, but I also wrote 3 plays based on her, which are being workshopped these days. She likes to carry a bottle along to take a few slugs, and she wears layers of clothes, and she's smart, though. So you're going to hear possibly elements, some literal 2 or 3 word quotes from people like Shakespeare, maybe Thomas Traherne. Miro, the painter, I think, is referenced, and various musicians, Mozart, Schubert, John Lennon, things. So if you recognize things, those aren't accidental. That's meant to be that way. I don't think I need to say anything else about it. She's wandering through the countryside, and she's considered by others to be crazy. So she listens to summer rain among the poplar leaves. There's a place for a little child. Morning glories and peonies along a weathered fence. She sings like someone she once heard. The songs are old, of cradles, shawls, and longing. Crazy Bone hitches her skirt and dances like the Greek. There's Tartar in her blood. There are horses in her dreams. Crazy stares at a fox standing at the edge of the clearing. This has nothing to do with me. Now, right now, nothing. She sinks slowly into the grass. This is how it is, always. The fox turns its head to gaze at Crazy. No one ever looked on me like that, and is gone. Crazy crouches in the morning like a chimpanzee. She smiles at the thought and hoots. Who could have known? Hooting. Like the bird of desolation in a moonlit field. She remembers entrails and a prophecy. Crazy, rising on trembling shanks. Like I'm in National Geographic. Me and my disposable thumb. Time. Where's my place? Crazy Bone leaves a trail through heathen grass. Her dress darkens with dew. She moves heavily in a dream. Pines emerge vaguely from the mist. Before shepherds and before their dogs. Crazy shudders into the day, wild-haired with memory. I combed and I combed and I combed. Crazy flings her arms outstretched. She swivels slowly to dry her skirts. Before, it was before. Crazy tugs a red dress from the line behind the abandoned house. I will wear this wedding and I will marry. She lets her blue dress slide to pool around her feet, naked in the sun and dazed. I will marry nobody, and no one marry me. Crazy picks wild flowers to weave a headdress. With this crown, I marry myself. She slithers into the red dress. Ah, look at me, in my wedding colors. I am thief of the rainbow. I am anything I was born to. Arms raised, Crazy dances like a flame, making my escape. Me, myself, and I. Crazy Bone closes her eyes to pray, a slice of bread in her lap. For what I am about to receive, one eye squints open, from above and below. Crazy opens her bottle and takes a long pull. She raises the bottle to gaze at it. The spirit in me is the spirit in you. Crazy laughs, standing to take a bow. Fire and water, water and fire, and earth and smoke, yada, yada, yada. Branch to branch, Crazy climbs a tree. Birds and leaves around her and the green glimmer of light. There's a woman, then there isn't. She clambers to a higher branch, her shoes dropping to the ground, like she never was, and no one was. Crazy shoves leaves aside to see the sky. Oh, for the love of the Lord God feral, and me, myself, and my country senses. The river has a mouth, and I have ears. Crazy Bone draws her shawl around her shoulders. She stands by the water of approaching winter, a broken willow dipping into the narrow Seine. She's found an icy moon in the late afternoon. It is pleasing to me, the end as the beginning. One hand filled with stones, Crazy calls across the river, her other hand rising to her mouth. Yesterday, I was a sparrow falling to earth. Today, I am a Miro tadpole. Crazy takes off her shoes and hangs them around her neck. She walks into the stream, holding her skirt to her waist. Her shawl slides into the water, and the current takes it. Like an Irish maiden with seaweed clinging to my thighs. And all the millenniums just pass away, like slippery silver fish gliding by my ankles. Crazy reaches the end of a path. She stops to gaze across a clearing. The shadows of trees grow longer. Standing here like the god of all time, well, maybe not quite that. Servant of thunder, slave of this place. Something high and mighty, me and the gods, nose to nose. And who can say whatever? An owl with a bone to pick. A blackbird with its grievous wound. One foot jiggling, I was listening to the radio, listening to drunken notes from a piano. You know, that growly voice with his hammered clavier? Remembering a parade in Seville with its crosses and Christ held high. Remembering a brilliant snow-lit night, and further back, where the seasons run together, my grandparents 10,000 years ago. Them walking across the world, always moving, always on their way to water, and water always on its way. Wishing for some Yoruba diviner, anyone to guide me back to the idea of my life. Some dream in some cave in some mind. Crazy taps her head and smiles. There is an animal in my brain, and some days I go cold as a rattler. She looks back over her shoulder. But where's love when you need it? If it's anything you need at all. From the edge of a clearing, she watches a man standing in the field. He doesn't move, just his hair in the breeze. The afternoon wears away to the horizon's glow. Him standing there like a mystery, like Lot stood stone still, like some astonishing god from a golden age, or a silent troubadour in medieval times. He must have something to say. He turns suddenly and stares at Crazy. Whoa! Right through me like a prayer. Nature holds it, snot and spit, and holds the broken chair and baby carriage. Holds, well, pretty much everything, grows it or buries it, settles it all in a long sleep, crows in their roost, fox in its den. But if I may be so bold, what is nature? Those wild cars thrashing down country roads, dust raised to the height of trees, the cars' small silver flashes. And those cars and boozing boys and the slippery girls are all wild. That drunken Ukrainian dance, with fiddles and guitars, and the Lutherans and Catholics square dancing into a hazy memory. Swing your partner, he calls, swing them round and round. Some step out of the barn exhausted, howling among the moonlit poplar trees. Crazy lights a cigarette, smoke a halo around her head. And this is the time for knocking, you know, knocking at the door. And loose hinged doors swing open, the cars rocking in the parking lot. And I squirmed on that leather seat, still sticky from the day's sun, spread and pinned like a butterfly to a moment of my life. That was then, and this is then, though many winters have come between. Crazy Bone gapes, astonished, as a pickerel falls from the sky. Well, I guess the one that got away. She smacks it on a stump and guts it quick, her hands steaming from red entrails. She stands up, straightens her back. Crazy pushes a stray hair with the back of her hand. So, there's a fish. Where's the loaf? Mirror, my mother said. Look in the mirror and comb your hair. On her knees, Crazy gazes into the river. Listen, I can whistle Mozart, something churchy, or plunk piano keys like Schubert in that hotel bar. Window, mirror on the wall, and those bowls in the caves, those hidden, unbelievable bowls. Crazy splashes her face, then stands up slowly. I am becoming old. Becoming something or other. Light everywhere and nowhere, or maybe whatever. She loses her balance, stumbles and falls. Ha! Not much of a stump speaker. And my sermon unmounted. She makes a sweeping bow. And now for my next number, blah, 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 blah. Crazy takes a loud bite from a Granny Smith. Neither food nor thought, but both. There are things neither true nor false, things that float between or hover above. There are trains that come and go, and there are bandits who blow up the tracks. I'd like to build a little house to set on fire, a white curtain fluttering from a window. Crazy's walking sideways through the trees, like slipping through a keyhole. She stops at the edge of a clearing. I dreamed God, now by God I am dreamed. Just me, myself, and my carcass. Crazy stands still gazing across the field. Spanish horses and me sabotaging my life, always looking for another. What is needed can be stolen. Gods are brought down from high places, a horse blanket, a warm stable, and a pocket full of rose hips, holding two thoughts I cannot pull apart, and a third thought having nothing to do with God's. When I wake, I'll wash my face in the river, and if by chance I tell the truth, well, the joke's on me. And a grave is a grave. My third thought, perhaps, every third thought, and me just thin and bones. A bone juts out from earth. Crazy kicks it free. All the bones that have been dug up, and the more that have not been found. She brushes dirt off the bone. Cattle, too, are human, don't you think? Crazy waves the bone like a talisman. I was in the cave, and I am here. Isn't that the truth? Tattered and scattered. She wraps the bone and returns it to earth. Someone said, ask and it will be given. That's never worked for me. But trouble I have always found. I have not sung with the sweet anodynes. To err is divine. I said that. Lolling like a lollard, a mumbling sister to the dead. Whatever I am, I've been. The many dead I've buried. That unearthly city, the earth of us all. Crazy stops and stands. Well, I give a rip. That's Crazy Bone. That's probably about, each page is a section, but it's one long poem. I want to read what I call my comma poems. They literally began because I was starting a poem about a haircut. There's one haircut I received from my father that's always stayed in my memory because it hurt so much. As he used these clippers, and he was an impatient man, and so they were always tugging. And the more I cried out, the angrier he got. It was quite an episode. So I wrote down haircut, and then suddenly realized, but wait, I've written about this already in an essay. So I put a comma down and said, again. And then it just developed from that. I've now written 150 of these poems, comma poems, where I overuse commas. Suddenly it was interesting what commas did. And the second part was I got back into Chaucer. And I came through it through a renewed interest in Low German, and reading up on it and studying it a bit and realizing that Low German came from the Saxons, as did English, as we know it. And just the accidents of history mean that ours was an unwritten, spoken dialect, which was not kosher, and English became this powerful language throughout the world. But same roots, they were equal at one time. And that led me back to Chaucer, Middle English and Old English, and just that relationship. You know, it's totally intrigued me. The word father comes from Sanskrit. I don't know if you knew that. The word pitar, P-I-T-A-R. And you know what that becomes when you get to the Mediterranean? Pater. And then you go through the German phonetic shift, I think they call it, where the P becomes an F sound. Pater becomes Vater, which in England became Fadre, and father, and of course we said Foda. Just that relationship of stuff. You know what I'm saying when I say, unsere Vater ure Theote art in Hefnem? You get what that is. That's Old English. I mean, that's how we used to speak, right? Around 700, 800. And then Chaucer is the key figure who tried to standardize spelling and so on. But it intrigued me that I could misspell, and that was okay, because I haven't standardized yet. So I started writing these comma poems with lots of commas and throwing in Low German and High German and Middle English words occasionally, just to see what it did. They all average about 10 lines, and they're all one sentence. And I shouldn't over-explain. But the first couple of poems are literally set in London during Chaucer's time. He lived above a gate in London that still exists, I believe, called Aldgate, or the Old Gate, and he lived above it. So he saw everything that came and went from London. And this first poem is literally just kind of a description of that. It's called Aldgate, comma, passing the time. Aldgate, the smell of dung and hay, the cries of merchants, the city arriving and leaving, bawling beasts driven in, and the blood of slaughter, the stench of death, of weaponed men, the stink of flesh, of dead dogs' carrion, and whip and voice and plod. A beggar passing the time, always passing the time, passing through the gate, that moment of shade, and a rustle of skirts, the snort and snot of horses, flies around a spiked head, traitor or murderer, and the murmured prayers of Holy Trinity Priory, the monks relieving themselves outside the gate, which they did. There was a ditch there for them to relieve themselves. They didn't have right guard or those kind of products. Still with Chaucer, ranters with slanging talk, bumping into butchers, cooks, and fishmongers with blood and slivery scales on their hands, and the call of stalls, meat pies and geese, godsips at the pump, gossip's lifeblood, and holy madmen barefooting through their visions, with Chaucer turning down Old Jewry Road off to Wool Wharf, still wondering the dream and shaky from a restless night of fever, stopping for new tidings and pealing bells from all over town, breaking the day, the season, breaking the spell, and spelling out the liturgy in thin air. Apparently you heard bells all the time. They marked off times of day, times of season, times. Try to imagine living in London at that time. It's just like 2 or 3 square miles only, very small. This one also has a poet in it by the name of Thomas Traherne, a 17th century poet that I like very much. And I decided I could do anything with these poems, and so I included, my wife had a half-brother who she never got to know. He was killed when he was quite young in a car accident. And she found a few years ago that she found his thesis at the UBC, his MA thesis, and it was on the Renaissance sonneteers. So, although Traherne's not a Renaissance sonneteer, I thought I'd put Ian into his name, Ian Dunn, into this poem and myself. So let's see if it works. A child. Oh, and I should add, Traherne was notorious, might be the word now, famous for his notion of the innocence of childhood, and that anything that happened afterwards was essentially a fall. What he called custom, what he could call tradition, what we could call education, how our parents, everything that we learn takes away the immediacy of being that child. And that was Traherne's belief. He wrote, "How like an angel came I down." And then it was all downhill from there. A child. That's what I felt like in a conversation with Traherne at the back of the bar, talking about school, about thrashings. The Bible's shortest verse, he thought, was Jesus' reaction to the child chimney sweep. And Ian Dunn arrived for a drink, seemed to know Thomas well, sometimes staying at the manse, drinking while Thomas talked about innocence, and then Dunn turning things on their heads, sin as salvation, for instance, and sobriety as the root cause of idiocy. And Thomas laughing, slapping the reading desk with his hand until his skull jumped, and him saying he'd like to be buried right there beneath the desk, but first he'd like a drink. But Ian was reciting Marvell, and suddenly Traherne was gone with the skull under his arm, and I left as well, falling from the sky. We had a wonderful poet in Winnipeg who died maybe 10 years ago now, Patrick O'Connell, not well known. Patrick suffered from chemical imbalances. So when I knew him, he couldn't hold down a job. And sometimes he couldn't keep an apartment. And I'd already moved to Vancouver when I was told that he was living on the streets in cardboard boxes. So a bunch of people put money together to at least get him off the street. And I used to visit him once a week. He'd pull out his cheap guitar, a Stella guitar, and he'd sing his latest poems. And he told me once, his first poem he ever wrote, he was well into his 30s, he was having a bath, and suddenly a poem emerged in his head. He leaped out of the tub without drying off. He said, wet trail to the kitchen table, and wrote his poem. So there's a poem about O'Connell, not to be forgotten. O'Connell, not to be forgotten, in his emporium of sweets, whiskey, beautiful phrases, and any number of sundries, shopping bag, guitars, and the first poem. I could rummage there for a year, but he did not give me the year. A postponement. He was building a case with his Stella, tuning his strings toward an end, rising from the table where he had gambled his blood and health, collecting coins like war medals, rising to his height, speaking slow and slowly clearing the haze until we couldn't see. He was a very interesting guy, Patrick O'Connell, died in his sleep. Kind of how a lot of us will end, I guess. He wasn't that old, but phoning me for money so he could buy Depends diapers. Poem called Freiheit, nicht umsonst. Freiheit, nicht umsonst. You know what you desire, like breath, what you need, what drives you, like thirst, and you're restless without it, your feet in tight shoes, itching in woolen socks. Unruhig, a wanting to abandon humans, that's it. Or that's a price to pay. A soul without community, or almost. There are always those who long to be gone, but hang around for the taste, a shot of rum, an orange, hanging around for the smells of sex, of smoke, the feel of silk or air, for the unehrlich. A child's shout, ready or not, here I come. A poem I wrote imagining my parents sitting at a window while my mother was pregnant with me and choosing a name. And I was named after an Irish ballad, so that's actually autobiographically true. My mother was a great fan of Scottish and Irish ballads. She would sing me to sleep with them. The two, her swollen moon, and him thumbing through a baby book, trying to name their unborn child, their first, rocking somewhere in the sea, lost, flailing, unavailable and unknown. And the woman, still a girl herself, not naming him for some patriarch, some success story, but after an Irish dream, a song of drowning, some dark prince. And the father, in his pride, what he has engendered, what will carry his name forward. The two naming their son one night, sitting by a window, watching a thunderstorm sweep by. Two of them in a dream of their dream, so lovely, and not knowing the cost of waking up. The ballad was the ballad of Sir Patrick Spence, who drowned with his hat floating in the sea. Anyone remember that poem? Landscape, a child's mind. It is everything, allus. A grave too big. Make one place everywhere, and the child live there, loose as the wind, though he be no star, but a mortal fire. Quick-eyed, he sees motion in a stillness, a heartbeat in a stone, instinct in camouflage, and a weasel in a sandy entrance, and everywhere, right here, moves his mind, from bloom to blossom, sliding on the blade of the gardener's shears. Maybe. One of the most irritating things in my life is when my computer questions me. On screen. Did you mean? Well, yes, I meant what I wrote, what I said, what I thought. I mean what I'm thinking, and please stop changing my spelling. Stop removing the commas I love. They are weapons. They are fifth columnists. Knout to be seen before your very eyes, like cats in the night sliding by Lily Marlene beneath a street lamp. Everyone asleep, lulled and gulled und so weiter. I don't care. They're dead. And that is what I meant, comma. It insists on a poet uses punctuation how he wants. Keep putting commas in where there are none. This poem was probably a bit of a response to trying to figure out the mind of an absolutist, whether it be a terrorist or a prime minister or whatever. A man wanting order. A man wanting order seeks flaws. The reasons behind all anguish, seeks a certainty of reasons, a certainty to stand upon, so he may rest, the wheel turning on, that he may order all the world, that he may find the strongest rod to poke into the spokes, a rod unlike any other, only this one, from God, to stop history, to hold sin in hand, to crush it, to hold man in hand, woman, to fall off the wheel into perfection, timeless, filled with the fear of God, not awe, but terror. The certainty of that, the pure surrender, the flawless smile on the face of the world. I had a cat called de Duve, which I'm not sure is a Swedish word meaning the dove, but many years ago in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a short before a movie that was a put-on of Ingmar Bergman called De Duve. I don't know if anyone else here saw it. And I was sitting there with a friend, Wayne Teffs, who believed it right to the end. I spotted it after a while, knowing a little bit of German, Low German, that they were making stuff up. But De Duve, and that's what I had a Himalayan cat. De Duve, my Himalayan cat, long gone to earth, in some ditch, a grisly thing. thinking of her for a moment. We weren't close, but we lay together on a rag rug on Assiniboine one day. Her purring and out of focus, my eyes too close. Just that moment where it felt like I entered the bubble of her animal thinking. And she dreamed into mind, Drummondie. All of us, our mothers by the fire, the cave opening behind them, that dark wachstove. Drummondie is Danish for dreamland. You know wachstove, eh? Waiting room? I should soon stop here. It's enough. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Am I on there? Wonderful. What a voice. What a sense of that pace, that voice. It's beautiful. Thank you so much, Patrick. You started off by saying about Crazy Bone that it doesn't name the place, but you grew up in Manitoba.
It's rural Manitoba, yeah.
So after all this time,
Yeah.
is that still,
It's the place of my imagination.
that's where you go?
Yeah, it's never going to be the West Coast. No. I went there when I was 50. Fully formed human being.
So you can go to Barcelona, you can go to London.
I can incorporate
But when
these
you
things.
settle in, it comes back to the prairie.
Spain, like cities like Barcelona, are kind of my getaway cities, my getaway place. Hildy reminded me today, I wrote a poem a long time ago, 35, 40 years ago, called, what was it called? I Could Have Been Born in Spain? Yeah. So that's long before I ever went there. It was a place of imagination, too. Yeah.
But there is a sense in your work. I'm fascinated by this sense that there is this default, and yet you continue to find the other places that you can go to. And it seems to me that your work does something similar with time, that there is this expansive vision as he moves from right now, this dirt on my feet, to Chaucer, to the walls in Spain of 700 years ago, as he mentioned in another one.
It's that close, right? It's
Oh, is it?
oh, sure.
How so?
Well, first of all, in terms of time, you know, if I live to be 80, let's say, that's nothing. You know, that's,
Yeah.
well, 700 years isn't much longer. When you think of, they say the Earth is millions of years old. And inhabited, people have found cave paintings 30,000 years ago, 30,000 years old. So there was art 30,000 years ago. Someone left a handprint with a broken finger. And that's us. That's us. So not hard to go back to Chaucer, really.
Especially if you have the Low German.
Especially when you have the language mix, yeah, and you realize you came out of that long stretch of language changing and shifting, and how it will keep doing that. We've been throwing these numbers around. Does anyone know how many words there are in English? Any guesses? The number I'm going to give you is like 15, 20 years old, but 900,000 words. Shakespeare used 23,000, so he was a piker. French only has 70,000. Two totally different approaches to language, right? The one, they want to keep it pure and standardized, and they have committees that meet to make sure that there aren't too many foreign influences. And the English language goes around the world, you know, like a whore. You know, come on.
Yeah.
I'll take your words, I'll take anything.
And now with texting, who knows? Who knows?
Well, that's another language, yeah.
So are you conscious when you set out to do your reading of this breadth of going back and in this this blink of an eye that is 700 years, or to different places around the globe? You seem to have a sense of almost of a research imagination that then comes out into the poetry in image.
Well, different things happen at different times, right? You go into some kind of a phase for whatever reason, like writing these crazy little poems, 150 of them now, because of an accident of haircut. Oh, again? And that was it. That got started. So you don't know. And then after that, that clicks with the fact that for some reason I'm rereading Piers the Plowman by Langland, which is a Middle English long poem. And then to Chaucer, and then thinking of Low German, and then ordering Jack Thiesen's dictionary and starting to look at that and disagreeing with some of his spellings.
That's right.
And then thinking, but Chaucer spelled the same word 2 or 3 different times sometimes because he didn't succeed in standardizing it. And suddenly that whole mess of language and of a culture is very present on my desk, right? It doesn't take long and you're there.
That sense of malleability of language.
Yeah, and
must
time
just be a
disappears.
playground.
Time disappears, and then who knows what it will be next year at this time, I don't know. As long as I think as I'm working with words, with language, then there's always something opens up, doors open up, yeah.
It's one of the things that I like about Patrick's work is that you never know what you're going to get when you open it.
Did you notice the James Joyce in the... Did anyone notice James Joyce in the first poems I read, The Crazy Bone? No. The image of the woman in the water with her skirts up and weeds on her thigh. It's from Portrait of the Artist of the Young Man. One of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen. And there's Stephen watching this and losing all his faith. His Catholic faith, because of many things, but symbolically right then, because of the sheer beauty that he's seeing. Not just the beautiful woman, the beauty of that water and that seaweed on her thigh and so on. It's just such gorgeous writing, you know? Jimmy Joyce.
So you mentioned that Crazy Bone, this book of poetry, and this is the first time you've read from it, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, that's a pleasure.
Could you differentiate the voices a little bit? As I read?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Not only because of the tone, but
I
there's a
tried to do something a bit different.
Yeah, but there's that shift in focus.
Okay.
As well.
Yeah, good.
You mentioned there's also 3 plays about Crazy Bone.
I'll tell you how it started. I wrote a book quite a few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, called Carrying the Shadow. And the whole poem was essentially about death and dying. And on one page, I created a character called Crazy Bone, a little prose section, and she's a woman who wanders around town wearing a flowered hat and a flowered dress, and she suddenly disappears, and I can't remember what else. Maggie Nagel is a wonderful actress who now lives in Winnipeg, who was in The Shunning when it first played in 1985, and she wrote me a letter saying, I saw this Crazy Bone, why don't you write a stage piece? So I had that in mind for about 5 years. And when I write plays, I usually first write them as poetry and then adapt them to the stage. So I wrote about 50 of those Crazy Bone poems, and then I went and wrote a monologue of her wandering through it. In the play, it's more expansive. She's just escaped from a mental home where she had shock treatment, St. Martha's, and she's wandering through the countryside, essentially getting away and just... So the play and the poem interplayed. Things happened in the play that I then thought, oh, I better bring that in among the poems. And then I finished the monologue, and then I'd long had the idea I wanted to write something called The Sitter, because my Uncle Henry was called The Sitter, Bezetta, because he sat with dying people. He did it just voluntarily on his own. Sometimes he sat with them. If someone was sitting there, he would do errands for them. He was out helping, right? And I was always impressed by that. And interesting, when he was dying, I sat with him. And he woke from his coma, and he sat up and he entertained me. Like, he was sitting me, the living guy, you know, that's how it felt. Anyway, so I had that title. It never worked as a poem, never worked as a short story. And suddenly I thought, Crazy Bone can be the sitter. So I wrote a 2-person play where she's sitting with a dying real estate lawyer. And that's essentially the play. And that led to her being in an old folks' home. Okay. With a Spaniard who swears all the time, and a retired politician, and his new wife, who he's met at the old folks' home, and I think someone else, I can't remember. Anyway.
I want to see
that's
this.
all
I want to see this
interweaves, you know. That last one isn't finished.
So what is it about genre, then, that you want, that when you set out to write a play, which for those of us who don't write plays and poems and so on, would seem to be such a different genre, that you come back to poetry to begin? Is it that this is...
Foundation of language for me.
Okay.
Yeah. poetry. And I've always thought that probably ancient human beings, before shepherds and their dogs, first of all danced. That's just my preference, that they danced and acted out things and made noise, imitational noises, and gradually this noise came to represent things. In English, the letters ST remarkably seem to stand for solidity and stability and aggression and things like that. So if you think of words that start with ST. And so I'm thinking, that sound must have represented something first, and then the words come out of that. I mean, I have no proof for this. But it seems to me that it's all about sound, and you mix sounds with events and with people, and then words come out of that. And then someone spells it, but they misspell it, it turns out, and they spell it another way later, right? And so you have a word like, I say, who's in power? In Texas, they say, who's in power? P-O-W. And in England, that's England. In Texas, they'd say, who's in power? So you have three spellings of the same word, P-A-R, P-O-W, P-O-W-E-R. It's, who said it's standardized? My friend Per, who I co-translate with, is Danish, and he said Danish didn't get centralized and systematized until the radio. And then dialects started dying. In Italy, apparently that happened with television. There are hundreds of dialogues, but a certain one got chosen, right? For various reasons, I guess. And then through the power of the media, that became the language. Italian. No one pays any attention. The poet Pasolini, I forget what was the dialect that he came out of and that he wrote out of sometimes, but it was a dialect that was, yeah, it was Italian, but it was not the recognized Italian. And he tried to keep that dialect alive. And I have a friend in Denmark who does that too. He grew up with a dialect just as I grew up with a dialect, right? So how do you keep it alive? Do you need to keep it alive? Language is being lost every day, you know.
What gets lost when the language goes?
What gets lost? Oh, people, culture, spirit way of looking at the world, you know. First Nations language, for example, if those disappear, it's a certain kind of spirit will that disappears with them. Because it's not the same in English. I'm sure it isn't. And it's so weird what human beings do. I mean, first of all, we make laws that they can't have potlatch, for example.
Right.
You know why? That was a capitalist law. It didn't make sense that you gave away your wealth, which they did at potlatch. So we will make this illegal. It cannot be. These people are crazy. And that touches on the notion of the gift. There was a culture in the South Seas someplace where a family would have a stone, and it didn't have to be anything extraordinary about it, and they'd hand it on to another family as a gift. And they'd keep it for a year, and they'd hand it to another family. Nothing in return. And after about, I think it was like 9 or 10 years, it might end up back to the first family. That was the thing you had to do. You had to hand it on after a period of time. Well, this doesn't make sense to us, but it bound the people together. And there was the act of giving. And the act of creating a gift, which at its best I think literature does, or poetry should do that. It's, you give a gift and then you get it back some other way, right? And it just keeps going. And that's how you keep human beings together, and language. That's a long-winded way of saying that you're losing a gift when you lose language. I didn't think that when I was young. I didn't think of it even. But it's quite horrible if you think of it. I've read somewhere that there are like a dozen languages a day or a week, I forget what it is, that disappear.
Full worlds.
Hard to imagine that number, but. And in our great centralized global economy world, right? Everything comes together. Much easier to control people that way too, if you don't have separate groups and languages. Anyway, I'm preaching now.
No, that's just fine. I'm thinking of an essay Hildy wrote actually about mother tongue as shibboleth in Mennonite writing.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this sense, I think, and certainly when I hear you read your the new poems and you shift languages, I can't follow you into these other languages. And there's a sense in which when you make that shift, it becomes, it's just sound, and it still means, but it means in a different way, right?
Yeah.
I don't have that abstract relationship to the language. It's something else, almost a return, as you're suggesting.
Yeah, I'm not really good at languages either, at learning a new language, for example. But I only spoke Low German and High till I was 5 or whatever. So that's in me, right? And what I'm trying to do there with those languages is not make something obscure, In fact, usually they put in a context that the word is probably relatively easy to access, I think. But just trying somehow to weave it all together.
Yeah.
You know, how I use language today and where it came from. Like when I first read in Denmark, there was a woman in the audience who was a Danish Mennonite. And her name was Reimer. And she insisted that was a Danish name. And my friend Per said it is. And some of the other poets I met, there was a Harder.
Yeah.
Harder and Reimer, the two I mentioned, there were 4 or 5 what I thought were classic Mennonite names. They're Danish. You're crazy. And at Capilano University, I was giving a talk there once a number of years ago, and one of the teachers was forget her first name or last name, I think was Jansen. And after I talked about the Danish thing, she said, I'm Danish.
Jansen.
Dorothy Jansen, or whatever her name was, yeah. Speaking Low German and being Danish.
It's interesting how
You couldn't make that up.
Yeah, it's interesting how the names shift. I remember when I lived in Winnipeg, I moved into an apartment complex near Corridon. And as I was moving things in, there was a knock on the door, and I went and answered the door, and there was this short older man, and his kind of peeking around a strapping young guy, and he says, "Where's Zacharias?" That's me. I said, I'm Zacharias. And he looks at me, "You're not Greek." I said, "No, that was it. That was it."
Well, you know Crazy Bone was dancing like a Greek. You noticed that.
I got that.
Who would that be, by the way? Zarba. And I have Tartar blood, so that's Tartar good.
I got that.
I can see it in my mother and her sisters, the older they get. So it was always a legend, and probably isn't true, but I choose to believe it.
But what is truth? I have one last question for you, then we'll open it up to anybody who would like to jump in. I'm always interested when there's moments, when people who have been writing for a while take a look back and sort of get a sense of the arc of their work. You did that, of course, last time you were here when you brought out sort of 35 years of writing and took us on a bit of a journey. You also did something similar in a recent Rhubarb interview. Now, who did the interview with you? The name is...
Was it about plays?
Yes.
Oh, that was Per Brask interviewed it.
Okay,
yeah.
There we go. And you were reflecting, there's a moment there where you reflect on sort of the trajectory of your protagonists over the course of your career. And there's a line that really struck me, and I thought this was a chance to ask you about it. You said, and I'll just quote you for a moment if I can, that over the course of your career, you say you've moved from the discreet, earnest, idealistic stance of Peter, this is in The Shining,
yeah.
toward deflection, humor with bite, a kind of loose carelessness, as if it doesn't matter anymore. End quote.
And it doesn't.
What does that mean?
It doesn't matter anymore.
What doesn't?
Nothing. Just being alive is good. You know, the career doesn't matter. The jobs I did don't matter. I worked. I raised children. They're self-sufficient, and they're sure it matters in an emotional way. But you know, as I said at the dinner today, I appeared and I'll disappear, like all of us. And what do I leave behind? I leave behind children, who maybe some grandchildren, and 50 years. Pat Peters out, maybe. It just all goes. And that's okay. But what I mean, it doesn't matter. I don't mean that in a kind of anarchic way or destructive way. Just the word matter. It's just not of the flesh. It's just not material anymore. I don't know where I came from. I don't know where I'm going. I've got a couple of years here. And I have this weird thing called language that I happen to love from a very early age on. The next person is something else, right? Music. I wish I'd been a musician, actually, first and foremost. Not a musician, a composer.
Is that right?
Yeah, that would have been the first choice. I've always had this theory, I've mentioned it before here, I think, that all artists are doing their second favorite artwork. Because they can't quite get the first one, it's too close to them. And so with me, that would have been music. And so I think music works its way into the poetry.
Well, I was just going to say.
And there are other poets where you can see the visual, right? or movement or whatever. So it's a mysterious thing, because all children seem to me to be artists when they start, except once we start calling them artists, then it disappears. You know, we start saying color in the lines, or it has to go this way, there has to be form, instead of just going with their form. Yeah. That was the brilliance of people like Picasso. They went back to childlike painting sometimes. Right? Grandma Moses, do you remember Grandma Moses? Painter.
I like
And who's the prairie guy? Kurelik. What was his first name? Kurelik? William. Yeah, anyway.
No, I was just going to say I like this idea of moving from Peter to Crazy Bone.
Well, as a man, when I'm in my 30s, starting in my 20s and into my 30s, I have ideals and ideas, and I forget who once said, ideas lead to ideals lead to idol. I-D-O-L, and then idol, I-G-L-E. You know, you solidify the idea, and eventually it becomes an idol that you worship, and there's no more give and take. There's no more friction. It's there. This is the truth. Always has been, always will be. And then after that, you're idle, because it's dead.
You figured it all out.
What I've been really interested in with Crazy Bone is, and by the way, I think her name came kind of unconsciously from a Yeats character called Crazy Jane. And he wrote about, I think there are about 6 or maybe 8 Crazy Jane poems. My favorite poem of all ever, Crazy Jane meets the bishop. And so I think that the name Crazy came from that. But I wanted a trickster character, because I began recognizing, it got over, the role of the trickster in my own family. I had a great-grandmother who was very much a trickster. And my mother is, to some extent. I've got a son who's a big-time trickster, turning things on their heads all the time, making trouble that way, and enjoying watching that. And there's a book, his name is Hyde, I couldn't remember. Forget his first name, something Hyde, H-Y-D-E, wrote a book called Trickster Makes the World. And his argument is that without tricksters turning things on their heads and annoying people and destroying things, no progress. No inventions, nothing will happen. Because you'll just be locked into tradition and to the usual, what Traherne called custom, right? It takes the trickster to suddenly snap his fingers or do something, steal from you maybe, and suddenly there's a commotion and something happens.
Do you see
The
poets
First
as,
Nations people really have that down with the coyote and other things. Pardon?
I was just going to say, do you see poets as a trickster figure?
They can be. Most of them aren't, but they can be. Yeah. Poets change over the years as to how they're seen. I'm just reading the biography of Dylan Thomas and how he saw himself as a poet. No one sees himself that way anymore.
Huh.
It was a full-time thing. He never thought he'd ever do a job. You know, he thought people owed him money if he was running short. He'd ask anyone, no shame. Henry Miller did the same thing. I don't know too many that do that now, and I don't know if we'd accept them. But you know, let's say 100 years ago, you could probably have a hotel room for $5 and live there all year. And go down, buy some cheap food, and then go up and write. Can't do it. We've priced ourselves out of art. We really have. Artists are among the poorest of Canadians. Cuts, and we can't complain because we're artists, because we all wear tuxedos and go to events.
Right. You do what you love. I could keep this going for a while, but I'm going to open it up. Does anybody have any questions for Patrick?
Question.
Sure, please.
Talking about language, and you talked about the huge number of words that English has.
Yeah.
What do you think when you look at the young generation with texting and computer language and all that? Do you ever panic that we're
Oh, no, I don't.
our vocabulary?
I don't panic at what's inevitable.
Do you feel it's
But I get disheartened by it. Disheartened, and I know the human being is changing, not just the language, the human being and how he thinks and she thinks is changing. Going online and seeing endless links and following them is different from reading a book. I'm not saying it's worse or better, but it's different, and the brain changes. The brain is very malleable. So I think human beings are changing. So people like me are fast outdated, because we're still bookish and we still use language in that kind of way. There are poets now who write books based on texting. I've seen such a book. It's kind of a postmodern approach, breaking up language and so on. So, yeah, I don't like it, but what does that matter? That's what's happening. My mother hated technology. I inherited that from her. So
Trevor.
she can't operate a phone. She's 89, so that's partly the reason. But
Don't you think that that your work is somewhat amenable to that, though? Like, a lot of what you've done for us tonight,
Yeah.
one phrase after another, like a link to another.
Did it sound like texting?
You're a poetic texter.
It's possible.
Some of the things that young people do is
It's certainly possible. That's what I'm saying. I can't judge. I just know where I come from and what I inhabited, and that's my limitation, right? I come from a certain time and a certain culture and a certain way of thinking, and I tried to broaden it, but there's limits.
We've got a good selection of students at our event tonight. The best attendance of students at the right event yet.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if they resonate with what you did that brought that up.
I'll give you an example of the absurd involved with this. When I was still teaching at Kwantlen in Vancouver, and this is about 10 years ago, I had a classroom of 22 students and 2 doorways into the hall, and they're going to have a break. So some go to the front, some in the back. I went out the front, and I noticed a girl phoning, not texting, phoning to a girl who was at the other door, and they talked. They didn't meet. I go to movies, I watch half an hour of advertising, which I didn't pay to watch. And fewer people going to movies because they've got Netflix and stuff like that. I do Netflix too. Fewer people in music stores. Hard to go into a music store and find a worker there who can talk intelligently about their records. So to me, it seems from my old age, there is less intimate discourse and talk and communion. I could be wrong. And I remember when I was young, my parents were always talking like they're old fogies. So I may be the old fogey now. It's just my impression, though.
Here's my sense of what Trevor was saying that echoes true to me, is that maybe not in the language that you use, that it sounds like it will be amenable to the Twitterverse, but in the way in which you juxtapose ideas, times, places, narratives,
They got
come
that
right to
from
a
me.
next bang.
Let's get things in the right order here. Look where that came from.
Hey,
I have students, I still teach one course at UVic, and some of them seem to think nothing happened before 1990, which is maybe when they were born. And in one class, I threw out names like Hemingway and James Joyce, and no one had heard of these people. So I thought, was I doing the same thing when I was their age? No, I knew about Schumann and Schubert, and I knew about Catullus, and I knew all kinds of stuff. So has education changed, or did I just have a bad batch? I don't know. Because everything comes from somewhere, right? And in the course I teach, one of the characters I teach is Bob Dylan, which to me is fairly current. It isn't. Bob Dylan's, who's he? Well, they know about him, but they don't know about Virginia Woolf or Sylvia Plath or these other people. And they're mostly interested to hear about them, but why don't they know? I don't know. Why do they have to come to university to learn those little things? Isn't there something in the media and the culture that teaches them stuff? By the way, I don't Twitter, I don't have Facebook, I don't do anything online, so I don't understand that world, so I shouldn't comment on it too much.
Kyle.
Last time you were here, Patrick, you were interested in the long line.
Yeah,
I remember you talking about, and I think jumping in the asylum.
yeah.
Like on that. You even spoke then about how it was frustrating to you because the page has natural margins.
The page was limiting it, yes.
And I'm interested now, the comma. I mean, to me, the long line.
Yeah. Those were the last long line poems I wrote.
Were they?
Yeah. Since then, I've gone really short. With the Crazy Bone, they're all between 3 and 6 words and just couplets. It's very little words on the page. And with the comma poems, of course, they're dense, but they're comma broken. So it's quite different.
Because my sense when I read the long lines is that it builds up this kind of resonance, catch a break,
Yeah.
and just the sounds pile onto each other. And not that it becomes inaccessible,
Yeah.
it becomes resounding. Are you doing something intentionally different with
Yeah.
to bring things, I don't want to say to the surface because it's a metaphor that doesn't work very well, but is it keeping the resonance down in some sense to make it more accessible?
Or trying to get a resonance a different way. The long line is probably the most natural for me. It took me years to come up with that. And now it feels totally natural because it's how I breathe and talk. When I use these excessive commas, that's breaking something up, and I have, for another person, that's not a discovery. For me, it is right now. I love the comma more than any other punctuation, actually. Comma and then the semicolon. Semicolon's nice. I overuse semicolons in my prose. So I'm finding out what it does. I noticed as I was reading those poems today, I was still reading them kind of like they were long lines. I wasn't absolutely breaking at the comma. And it just felt, as I was standing there reading, that that would be too jarring. So maybe those poems are page poems. But I can't help myself, so in spite of the comma, if I remove the commas, they'd be long line poems again. So maybe it's all very arbitrary. I don't know. I'm finding out.
You should write online. You could just keep going and going and going.
Yeah. The Darth Vader of poetry.
Are there any other questions?
You know where Darth Vader, the name comes from, talking about language. You know what that means? Dark Father. I used to tell my kids that when those were current, my students, when those were current movies, and they were pooing all this language talk I was doing and mythological talk, and I said, well, look where Darth Vader comes from. Dark Father. Anyways, yeah.
Are there any other questions?
No, not a question, but just an observation that you sort of bring together the texter and the trickster.
That's good, yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe without doing it constantly, I've seen writing as an act of tricksterism. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think that sounds likely? I'm not sure. Because I've thought of
For
tricksterism.
you in particular, for sure.
Yeah, maybe.
When you look back over.
Maybe. And when I learned to think of things the opposite of what I thought, because it occurred to me that the brain is incredibly vast and incredibly limited. The brain doesn't move sideways very nicely. It goes like a train in tracks, right? To jump sideways is more difficult. And I think that's one of the things poetry does. It teaches us how to jump sideways. And in thinking about that, I thought, you know, I have set ideas. Why do I have them? Where did I get them from? And can I think that 180-degree opposite? And let myself think that. And I was surprised how often I realized that's actually what I believe. You know, about anything, philosophy, theology, whatever it was. You know, I had my set ideas, which were mostly in opposition to what I'd grown up with to some degree. But could I go back to that imagination? And I think that's something you have to do when you're a poet. You have to be willing to think anywhere, and so it's hard to become political because you realize how arbitrary that can be. You know.
But yeah, I think if you look back over your writing, there is that sense of even when positions are taken, there's a sense that there's a slippery that it can.
I love undermining my positions.
That's right. Yeah. Even as a step.
Say something, then undermine it. That's fun. That's the most fun in the world because you know you're full of BS to begin with. So undermine it and have some fun with it.
Okay, last question to Jim.
Patrick, your comment about what people know and don't know how to use language reminded me, when I began university, one of the things that the English literature profs sort of decried was that most of us had not, nearly none of us had taken Latin.
Yeah.
Right.
We didn't bring any Greek to our knowledge at university. And therefore, the allusions in literature that are so dependent upon that body of literature, and we're just there. I mean, we'd always need to have them explained in the margins.
Yeah.
As well as biblical material.
Yes.
So,
Greek mythology.
when I think of how little people know whatever I can be teaching, remembering that seemed a huge loss to them. They'd have to stop and explain these things to us.
And do those sources begin to disappear then?
Yes.
Yeah.
But because it may not be a literature that I read,
That's right, yeah.
it's unintelligible to me in a certain sense, as is mine, where I might have many allusions, say, to biblical references or historical ones that I'm interested in. So what is the impact of that with people having these very different bodies of shared literature, and then they have communities in which they share that literature.
And they're sharing a culture.
Yes.
And if someone, for example, I have a huge class at the university of 200 people I lecture, and a significant number, I would say, of those 200, probably 50 are Asian people. They don't get some cultural stuff that happens in that class, just as I wouldn't if I was in their class in Japan or China or wherever. So it's cultural to that degree, and they come up to me and they ask me to explain things that at first I think, well, why wouldn't you know this? Well, of course, it's not in your culture, and in your language, so you haven't got that. So that's part of it. So we think we should all, what, know Greek and Latin? I think that'd be great. We took Latin roots when I went to high school. But with the English class I was in the University of Manitoba, a small class, 10 people. There were 2 Mennonites and 1 Jewish girl. And the 3 of us got all the illusions. Because we knew the Bible, and we happened to also know the Greek mythology and Nordic mythology. All these other people they didn't know the biblical allusions. And Miriam Cohen and Albert Redicott and myself, we got them because we were brought up on this stuff, right? So it's a cultural thing again. And the others were very envious of us. Pardon?
Which one was the Jew?
Albert Redicott.
All right, let's leave it there.
But that's a really interesting question because you're talking about the limits of culture, and within that culture, are we losing something? With the texting and all that, because that's within our culture, but they're breaking down the walls of the culture and spreading it. It's an ongoing question, I think, and as a teacher, you must get frustrated sometimes. Do you? With students not getting the references?
Well, one of the hardest things to know after you've been teaching for a while is when you first learn something. You begin to think for a while that you knew it almost all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't realize you only learned it 2 years after graduate school, but you now know it for so long you're assuming undergraduate school.
Yeah, that's true too, yeah.
That's a real challenge pedagogically.
Yeah.
To learn that and try to think back. That's an immense challenge constantly.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there's also a pedagogical movement that intentionally breaks down those canons, right? So when I did my PhD area studies in Canadian literature, there was no list given to me. It was, you need to come up with a list of all the books that you think are important to read for Canadian literature. Then you need to justify that list, and then we can, so the construction of the canon then becomes a part of the negotiation, and it becomes a sense of a certain sense of politics to it. But I think what you've spoken to here, and Jim, you too, have spoken to the sense of loss of a shared tradition that comes from that as well. So it's a really interesting discussion to be had.
Yeah, which is why it's good to travel for a writer, probably. Not just travel like a tourist, but stay in one place and see what you can absorb. Excuse me.
So we'll leave it there today. Before we close by thanking Patrick, let me remind you briefly of the next 3 readings in the series. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be meeting here again with Brandt, who has just finished a new collection of poetry entitled Glitter and Fall. And just like we got to be the first ones to hear from Patrick's new book of poetry today, we'll be the first to get to hear from Dai's new work.
Can I
Yes, please.
There's postcards from the book out there, if you want to grab one. And I wanted to say, too, that Miriam Toews and I come from the same church, same congregation. She was born the year I left town. And her father was my grade 5 and 6 teacher, and so there's so many connections in the literary world.
Yeah, small.
In the Mennonite literary world.
February 18th, David Bergen. Any connections?
No, but I'm trying. There is one, but I don't remember what it is now, so it's not important. I talked to them once, and we found a connection. But I don't remember what it was.
David will be reading from his new book, Leaving Tomorrow. And then the series will conclude on Wednesday, March 4th, 2 weeks after that, with Carrie Snyder, who will be reading from her new book, Girl Runner.
Where's she from?
She's from here.
From here?
She's from here. She's from Waterloo, and I think she went to Grebel. Is that right?
Yeah, good.
And Girl Runner was shortlisted for the Writers' Trust this year.
Who published it, the book?
Excellent question. Somebody here will know that.
Anansi?
Anansi.
Good.
Yeah. So it's been a banner year for Mennonite writing. It's a pleasure, of course, to have these ongoing conversations, and in particular, to have you here tonight, Patrick. So the University Bookstore has again joined us. They've set up shop outside the doors here with Patrick's earlier works for sale. Do take a look at them, pick one up. Patrick's agreed to sign some books, and keep your eyes open for A Short History of Crazy Bone, which will be coming out soon. Please join me in thanking Patrick one more time.